All right, everyone. Today we're going to talk about a contraction force curve, and we're looking at it for a couple different exercises, and then we're going to look at some methods using equipment to modify that strength curve. If we zoom in, hopefully you can see this chart I've made. This is an example of a strength curve for the exercise, the bicep curl. That's the one where you hold the weight and just simply curl it on up. And I hope you can see this enough. On our left bar, we have contraction force, and the higher it goes means the harder the muscle is trying to contract. This would be measured with little electrodes on the muscles and pretty sophisticated equipment, and it would measure how much contraction force is needed via electricity in there. I don't know exactly the methods behind it, but there are ways to do it, and it would chart out. It would look something like this. This is the progression through the exercise. So the start position down here with the weight, end position up here in the weight, and this is the path through it. You kind of think about this as time, if you will. So start position, middle position, end position, all charted here. So if you look at this, and we put it together with contraction force and our position throughout the exercise, you can see that it is not equal. In fact, through the middle of the exercise is our highest contraction point. It starts off very low, builds, and then actually decreases as we get to the end of the exercise as well. And you can kind of think about this by holding that weight. If you held it in your hand, you're probably going to hold it somewhere down here. It's unlikely that you're going to stand here and hold it with your arm at a 90-degree angle, because this correlates here. This is this position here, and the highest amount of strength trying to keep this here. You might pull it all the way up to here, and you see the amount of contraction that needed is much less. So you can kind of visualize this, and you can feel it as you do an exercise. And this is for someone with a physics degree to kind of explain, but it's all about leverages. It has to do with the fulcrum point and the muscles pulling on your bones. And the simple explanation is the longer the leverage system, the more difficult it is. So as I'm here, this angle is smaller. This lever is a less distance from the fulcrum than it is out here. And et cetera, all the way down here, it's not as much either. So why is this important? It's not for all exercises, and it's just kind of some cool information to know about. With the curl specifically, there's not a whole lot you can do with this, but just take it into consideration and try to get the most out of your exercise. If you're only going to do, a small curl right here, you're only working out the smaller progression, and we want to have full range of motion. But that said, there's nothing stopping you from working on just certain points of the exercise as well. So with a heavy weight, yeah, you certainly can just go this first quarter and just work on that. And you can even start at the top and carefully lower down and then curl the top, back to the start, to the end position. Start at the end and go back through. And the curve is still pretty similar. I wouldn't say it probably gets to here. If it were drawn out a little bit better, I would say the end is probably a little bit harder than the very beginning, mostly because I'm trying to keep it from falling down. Maybe it looks a little more like that. Again, electrodes in the arms, it's a sophisticated ways of measuring can draw the curve a bit better, but for simplification, this is what it's going to look like for now. Okay, so the idea going behind this is we're looking at different uses of equipment. Okay, so you have resistance bands. So this is a free weight. That's important to know. That was drawn with a free weight. The gravity is their weight. And then we're going to use something that has, the word is, it's adding weight incrementally as you lift on up. So it's going to change the shape of this force curve. Instead of just being like a nice little easy curve, it's going to level out a little bit. Because the idea with the chain is that as I lift up higher, I add more weight. So from here to here, this is probably like 3 pounds. Now it's 4, 5, 6, 7, and I believe this chain is 12 pounds. If I were to lift every link up, I'd be holding 12 pounds now. And then vice versa. As I go down, it's actually a little easier. So that's kind of nice, especially here, I have less weight. So if I want to work on just this portion of this, I go from the harder position, the position where I can carry the least amount of weight, through a stronger position that I can carry heavier amount of weight. So that end of the force curve would look a little flatter yet. Right, I was going through half, starting here at the halfway point and finishing up. Because I'm adding more weight, I have now changed the shape of this to probably something a little more level. Because as I'm adding more weight, I still have to contract up, even though I have a better leverage system. And it may not be that high, because this would assume peak constant, like the peak, like a maximum effort. And this is not quite there, so it's probably more like down here. But it stays level all the way through the end position. And since I start here, that's just all it is. On the flip side, this would be spiking up very drastically if I did just the start position to the midpoint, because this is already our easiest position. And as I go up, I'm adding more weight into it. So I go from an easier to a harder position, both leverage and with weight. So this would be a very steep up to a high contraction. I would still go through middle, but it would be even higher. Hard to kind of visualize that. In fact, let's look at a different exercise, because the curl is just one, and honestly, it's one of the more difficult exercise curves to straighten on out, because it has both an easy point at the end, at the beginning and the end, and your hardest point is at the middle. If we change this exercise to something like a squat, we'll use a squat. And then I'll show it for maybe a push-up as well. Now we're at the squat. And if you imagine the start position is actually the bottom, we're not going to use the start position at the top. It just adds too much. In fact, this says down here, the contraction phase. So the contraction phase of a squat is when you're contracting your muscles up. That's why on the curl, I only used this portion. I didn't use the down portion as well. This was the start, this was the finish. For a squat, you're down here and you're contracting up. So start position is squatted down. And as you can kind of imagine, the lower you go, the more difficult it is. And the shallower you go, the easier it is. So the strength curve starts off very high, starts up at the top, and then gradually comes on down towards your end position. And that would be visualized by starting here. If my start position was very shallow, this is the hardest position, then I come up. And it becomes harder if I go lower. So the hardest position is squatted down, and that's your start position. As you come up, it gets a little easier. Okay, so now this is actually really useful. This is the point where the chains or resistance bands or adding incremental weight becomes really useful, because with a squat, you can imagine this being on a bar. I'll just hold it here for now. You'll get the gist of it. At the top, I'm holding all extra 12 pounds. So this is my end position, the top. As I start, I lower the weight. Okay, now I'm only squatting down here with, say, 6 pounds. So at the hardest position down here, I have the lightest weight. So as I stand on up, what would usually become less contraction force, because it's easier, the leverage becomes a little nicer, is having to stay pretty consistently strong because I'm actually adding weight. So I go down, the chains go down, the weight is lifted off, and then I stand on up, adding weight back to my lift. That would make our strength curve look something more where a traditional squat with regular a free weight with an accommodating weight, it would look something a little more, like this. Eventually, you could probably figure out how to straighten it out perfectly, and you could even add so much weight that the strength curve would start to go like this. It would be harder as you got all the way up. But it's just a cool thing to think of different ways to modify an exercise so that you have different contractions throughout the entirety of the exercise, rather than your just standard free weight. Free weight is just gravity and your body. Is it I before E except for probably weight? So I think it's EI? I don't know. Free weight, this could be chains. And interestingly, this isn't even how a resistance band would look. If you were to use a resistance band, because the further you stretch them, they gain force a lot more quickly, they gain resistance a lot more quickly. It looks something more like this, to the point where eventually you can't stretch it anymore because it just gains so much strength all the way through. So that's an interesting way to use resistance bands to add more resistance to the end of a squat. And like I said, you would use this just to add variety to your exercises so you don't get bored. But with this, because it accelerates on up, you have to contract a lot stronger all the way through the exercise. These are actually really good like speed training things, or power, things for like jumping higher or sprinting faster. This is an excellent tool to use because you have to really drive and keep some speed up. Another way to fight this is by having speed, because you decelerate as you go to the top. But if you start with a higher acceleration, you kind of have momentum, and you can kind of fight this a little harder. That's just a way to do it. But overall, I want you to kind of think about the strength curves, and different exercises have different ones. Remember, the curl had its most difficult point at the middle of the exercise. There are other ones that do that. Let's see, what's another good one that does that? Triceps do that as well. There's a lot of things where with the arm, since it's a single, just a hinge, it's really easy to kind of visualize that. The more 90-degree your arm is at the middle, the more difficult. As you get up here, it's not so hard because you're nearly straight. As you're way down here, again, the angle's a lot smaller. Tricep curl extension would have that curve. Other exercises that have this descending strength curve, like the squat, things that benefit the most from chains or resistance bands are things like the push-up. Again, if you were to do a push-up, the lower you go, the more difficult it is. So your starting push-up is your lowered position. Your starting position is the lower position, not the top in this regard, because you're only measuring the contraction of it. But you can just simply imagine, like if I said do some push-ups, if you're only doing like little quarter ones, they're a lot easier than going the full range. That's because starting deeper here is a lot more difficult than starting like right here and just pushing this a little bit. So the strength curve starts very difficult and ends very high. So if you only go, if you only do the quarter of the contraction phase, like here to here, you're reducing the amount of contraction. This starting phase would be way down here, having the most contraction all the way through. Then your halfway point would be like starting like midway through a push-up, and you only have you have a smaller amount of contraction force necessary to push you all the way through. But if you have a curve that goes down like this, the push-up, the bench press where you lie down and press the weight up away from you, or a shoulder press, most of those exercises follow a chart like this. So you could use the chains on the barbell to do a bench press, and that would be really great for the chest and triceps because it would level out that curve. You would have to contract stronger through the end position instead of the exercise getting easier. Same with the shoulder press. It doesn't work well for exercises like pulling so much. It does work pretty decently for the pull-up, but typically pulling exercises where you're pulling the bar up to you don't have a curve quite like that. The easiest position is usually down here, and then you are contracting through. And as you get higher up, it gets more difficult. So a lot of times you're hanging here, and you can make it move a little bit, but to pull all the way through is very difficult. So you wouldn't want to add more weight as you pulled all the way through. That would make it really challenging. Pushes, it works really well for, and a squat and deadlifts. But the whole idea here is I hope I gave you some cool ideas to think about, like a contraction force, the contraction phase of an exercise, and the difficulty progress of it. And if you don't take any home, like you still don't want to try these pieces of equipment like the chain out, which are really safe and they're not anything all that crazy. They just click onto a bar, or you can just hold it in your hand and do it. hopefully it inspires you to come and try something new for your workout. Try it out for 3 weeks. If you don't see any improvement, then drop it. It doesn't have to be a forever thing, but give it a real good 3-week effort and see if you like it. All right, come into the fitness center and I'll show you how to do these and I'll explain a little bit better. I'm much better in person when I can get some questions and give some feedback in real time. But I hope you enjoyed the video otherwise.